In the 1970s, the U.S. experienced a period of economic stagnation, largely because of inflation and spending in Vietnam and Great Society programs. Nixon implemented policies of Vietnamization, in which 540,000 troops would be pulled out of Vietnam and the war would be turned back over to the Vietnamese. He also implemented the Nixon Doctrine, in which the South Vietnamese would fight their own war and the U.S. would only supply them with arms and money, but not troops. Public frustration with the government grew during this time. A lot of people saw it as a poor man's war because the war was fought generally by the lesser privileged Americans, since college students and critically skilled civilians were exempt from the draft. There was also the My Lai massacre, in which Americans brutally massacred innocent women and children, which naturally decreased popularity of the Vietnam War on the home front. In addition, Nixon strategically sent troops to Cambodia, but when faced with huge opposition on the home front, withdrew them 2 months later. This increased the controversy that was going on at the time. The U.S. Senate repealed the Tonkin Gulf Revolution, and the 26th Amendment was passed, which lowered the voting age to 18. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were released, a top-secret Pentagon study of America's involvement in the Vietnam War, which only aided in widening the credibility gap that had begun to grow between the government and reality. Nixon did, however, succeed in easing tensions between the Soviet Union and China, ushering in an era of eased tensions. He did so through the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, as well as the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. On the home front, Nixon expanded Great Society programs, things like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He also made progress in environmental protection, such as the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air Act of 1970, as well as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Nixon took the nation off the gold standard as well. The Nixon landslide, however, did begin to grow in 1972, when the Vietnamese attacked again, but were stopped by massive retaliatory attacks ordered by Nixon. He bombed Vietnam despite promises of peace from Kissinger, until they agreed to a ceasefire in 1973. This was, however, little more than a barely disguised American retreat. Little was changed. It was then discovered there had been secret bombing raids of North Vietnamese forces in Cambodia. They did, however, end in 1973. This, again, widened the credibility gap that had begun to grow during this time and led to the War Powers Act of November 1973. The Arab nations imposed an oil embargo, which strictly limited oil in the U.S. and caused a fuel crisis. During this time, it was, however, lifted in 1974, but quadrupled the price of oil by the end of the decade. The U.S. experienced defeat in Vietnam when South Vietnam fell to the Communist North in 1975. A lot of troops were evacuated, and in this sense, they lost a lot of respect throughout the world. In terms of civil rights, Earl Warren had headed many controversial but important decisions, such as Brown v. Board of Education, which had ruled against segregation. Nixon appointed 4 new members, which caused a shift in the court to conservatism. They did, however, allow abortion in Roe v. Wade. The feminist movement was energized in the 1970s. Title IX prohibited sex discrimination in any federally funded education program, and Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. The Equal Rights Amendment sought to guarantee gender equality, but did not pass. Racial tensions were extremely significant during this time. There was the white flight to suburbs, which pitted the poorest whites and blacks against each other, often with violence. And during this time, whites often argued reverse discrimination, largely in response to affirmative action. The president began his unmaking in the Watergate scandal and all of the other events that had contributed to the credibility gap that existed at this time, which led to the first unelected president, Gerald Ford, who was unpopular because he issued a full pardon of Nixon and granted amnesty to draft dodgers. He did sign the Helsinki Accords, which recognized Soviet boundaries and guaranteed human rights and eased U.S.-Soviet situation. Jimmy Carter was then elected president in a close race, promising never to lie to the American public, and Democratic majorities were gained in both houses of Congress. Yet, despite an early spurt of popularity, Carter soon lost this popularity. He was a champion for human rights, especially black rights and privileges, and mediated peace accords at Camp David between Israel and Egypt, a long-existing conflict. However, huge inflation rooted in the nation's dependence on foreign oil was experienced during this time, and this led to a call to improve energy conservation, but it was mostly ignored by the gas-dependent American public. The strategic arms limitation talks, too, were signed, however, they weren't ratified in Congress, and this time saw the Iranian hostage crisis, which was highly publicized. Economic sanctions didn't work, and it was a humiliating failure for Carter. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and threatened oil supplies in the U.S., so Carter put an embargo on the Soviet Union. He also proposed a rapid deployment force, and that brought the end of this time period.